I lay in my small apartment, the kind where silence usually reigns, only the faint hum of city lights slipping through the window. The clock on the nightstand ticked relentlessly, but I couldn't sleep. Thoughts swirled in my mind, all tangled around Dale, my husband. He was away on a business trip and, as usual, had promised he wouldn't be home for at least another week. His voice over the phone had been distant, a reassurance that I would be alone. But that wasn't what bothered me at that moment. My mind wandered to someone else, Jackson. He was a close friend of Dale's, someone we spent time with often. He had always been around, but tonight, something about him was different. His gaze lingered in my memory, somehow deeper, filled with an unspoken intensity I couldn't quite place. The hours dragged on as I turned over, unable to shut out the image of Jackson's face. The way he looked at me earlier that week, when we had gathered for dinner, was still fresh. I reached for my phone, tapping the screen in an attempt to distract myself, but it was no use. The more I tried to focus on something else, the more he occupied my thoughts. He was Dale's best friend, for God's sake, and yet I couldn't shake the strange pull I felt whenever he was near. It made no sense. What was I doing, letting my mind wander down that path? I sat up, the cold sheets clinging to my skin. The clock ticked on. Maybe sleep would come if I tried hard enough, maybe if I just ignored the way my heart beat a little faster at the thought of Jackson. But in the end, it was impossible to ignore. I couldn't stay in bed anymore. The restless energy gnawed at me, and I knew sleep was out of reach. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold, hardwood floor pressing against my bare feet. Maybe a cup of tea would help, I thought. The warmth of the steam calming my nerves, giving me a moment of peace. I shuffled toward the kitchen, the dim lights casting shadows across the quiet apartment. As I opened the door, I froze. There he was. Jackson. He stood by the window, his back to me, staring out into the city, a cup of coffee in his hands. His casual stance was almost too familiar, as if he belonged there, as though he had every right to be in my space. The sight of him, even in the soft glow of the kitchen light, was disorienting. My heart beat a little faster, an involuntary response that I quickly pushed down. He didn't notice me at first, but as I stepped in, closing the door behind me with a soft click, he turned. His eyes met mine, and there was something in his gaze, something I hadn't seen before. It was like he already knew what I was thinking, like he could read the restless ache in my chest. A strange, knowing smile flickered across his face. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't friendly, it was something else. It was intimate, as if the space between us had suddenly shrunk. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and unspoken. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost teasing, as though he had been waiting for me to arrive. His words hung in the air, but the way he said them, the way he looked at me, it was like an invitation. I nodded, swallowing hard. "No, just restless, I guess." He didn't reply, but his gaze lingered a moment too long, and I wondered if he could sense the shift that had happened between us. We were friends, nothing more. But now, standing so close, the lines between that friendship and something else felt blurred, undefined. I could feel the unspoken tension building between us, thick and heavy, and I had no idea how to navigate it. I opened the cupboard and took out a mug, my hands shaking slightly. It wasn't just the cold. It was him, standing there, so close, yet somehow miles away. "You want some tea?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but the words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like a distraction from something deeper, something that neither of us were acknowledging. He nodded, stepping forward slightly, his eyes not leaving mine. "Sure. I'll take whatever you're having." I busied myself with preparing the tea, but my movements felt slow, deliberate, as if I were trying to keep myself from reaching for something I couldn't have, something I wasn't supposed to want. Jackson leaned against the counter, his presence still unnervingly close. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, like the silence between us was brimming with words that neither of us were willing to speak. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that this moment was anything but ordinary. Something had shifted, and I couldn't ignore it. Neither of us could. The tea steamed softly in the mug, but the silence between us felt suffocating. Jackson's voice broke it, low and thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about what I could have done differently." I glanced up, surprised by the heaviness in his tone. Like what? Just things I didn't do, dreams I gave up on. Sometimes I feel like I'm just existing, not really living, he said, his eyes distant. I feel that too. Like I'm stuck in a routine, like I'm losing myself somehow. Jackson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. It's hard to admit, isn't it, that you're not happy even when you have everything you thought you wanted. My heart raced, and I suddenly felt exposed, like he could see right through me. I don't even know how to fix it, I murmured. Maybe it can't be fixed. Jackson took a small step closer, his presence warm but unspoken. I don't think we should just accept it. We deserve more than that. I wish I could believe that, I whispered, feeling the weight of his gaze. And just like that, the space between us seemed to shrink, charged with a silent tension neither of us knew how to address. We stood there, close but not quite touching, the air around us charged with something unspoken. I could feel the heat radiating from him just inches away, and I couldn't ignore the way my body seemed to lean toward him, as if drawn by some invisible force. Jackson shifted slightly, his gaze flickering from my eyes to my lips, and I felt a tremor of anticipation. He opened his mouth, but then paused, his breath steady but shallow. It's hard, he said, his voice low. Being close to someone, but knowing they're not truly happy, not the way they should be. I nodded, my heart racing. His words felt like a reflection of my own thoughts I had been pushing away. Yeah, it is, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't look away from him. The space between us felt like it had been shrinking for a while now, and every second that passed made it harder to pull back. He moved a little closer, and I could feel the air shift around us. His hand brushed against mine, just a fleeting touch, but it felt like everything in that moment was building toward something more, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. I could smell the faint trace of coffee on him, the same as earlier, and yet it was now mingled with something else, something intoxicating. I don't want to just stand here, pretending like everything's fine, he murmured. I can't do it anymore. Before I could respond, his hand found my cheek, gentle at first, but with a quiet urgency that took me by surprise. His touch sent a ripple through me, and I felt myself drawn closer, unable to resist. I wanted to pull away, to stop it before it went too far, but the moment felt too fragile, too real to let go of. Jackson's fingers brushed my skin, and I froze. He was so close now, I could feel the warmth of his body pressing against mine, his breath mingling with my own. I knew the consequences of what was happening, but in that instant, all I could think of was how alive I felt, how intense this moment had become. When he touched my face, I didn't move away. Instead, I closed my eyes, letting myself feel everything, the tension, the desire, the fear. And in that breath, everything shifted. His fingers lingered on my skin, sending a wave of heat through me. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the tension between us snap, the moment now inevitable. His gaze never left mine, filled with an intensity that both terrified and excited me. He was so close now that I could hear his heart beating, steady like mine, only faster. And then, without another word, Jackson leaned in. His lips met mine, soft at first, like a question, but it didn't take long for it to deepen. It was a kiss full of urgency, full of everything unsaid between us, a kiss that carried years of hidden emotions, frustrations, and desires we'd never allowed ourselves to acknowledge. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. There was no apartment, no city buzzing in the distance. There was just him and me, and the overwhelming need to feel something real, something that wasn't wrapped in the constraints of a life that had started to feel too small. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. His touch was gentle but insistent, his hands finding their way to my waist, pulling me closer, pressing me against him. It felt like everything had been building toward this one moment, like the entire universe had been conspiring to push us to the edge. But even as I melted into him, I knew the consequences. I knew that this kiss, this stolen moment, could change everything. It could unravel everything I had built, everything I had believed about my life, about loyalty and choices. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to.